We have come together to honor the memory and celebrate the life of Friedrich Katz, Morton D. Hull, Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus in History in the College, extraordinary scholar and public figure, esteemed teacher, colleague, and friend, beloved husband and father. The Department of History joins the college and the Social Science Division and Humanities Division and the Katz Center in welcoming you and in extending our deepest sympathy to Jana Katz and the entire Katz family. Friedrich Katz, born in Vienna in 1927, educated in Mexico and the US, earned his doctorate at the University of Vienna and joined our history department at the University of Chicago in 1971, after teaching at the Humboldt University in East Berlin and as a guest professor at the University of Texas. His long service at Chicago continued even after his formal retirement in 2003, and his 20 years of inspired leadership as director of the university's Mexican Studies program endures today in the work of the Katz Center for Mexican Studies. You will hear much from other speakers this morning about his distinguished scholarship in Mexican history and the remarkable public resonance that it found, as well as the scholarly legacy that lives on in the generations of students whom he taught, the young historians whom he mentored, the 74 dissertation projects that he helped shape at the University of Chicago. Each of us have our own cherished memories of Friedrich. Mine include his warmly reassuring support of a Tyro chair, and our generous Quad Club lunches when he shared insights and reminiscences about his beloved Vienna and Berlin with an Americanist colleague who had also fallen in love with these glorious cities. Friedrich's was always a quiet but compelling and respected voice in department councils. If our departmental community has had a core and a conscience, it was embodied in Friedrich Katz.
first met Friedrich Katz at a Sanborn's restaurant in Mexico City, near the National University, in the fateful year of 1968. He was not what I expected. All I'd been told about him by Josefina Vázquez at the Colegio de México was that he was, quote, an interesting historian from East Germany. So I prepared myself for multiple translation challenges. Would my primitive Spanish or nearly forgotten college German be good enough to cope? Should I try to track down that last volume of Das Kapital I had never managed to get through? Could I manage to keep my undisciplined sense of humor from erupting into what I knew would be a very serious conversation? And then Friedrich appeared, a bit late, worried that he might have missed me, speaking in perfect, unaccented English. He was wonderfully patient and good-natured, with yet another graduate student seeking advice and encouragement. A few weeks later, Pat and I invited him and Jana to a Sunday lunch at our small apartment. Jana was unable to come. We did not meet her until they both visited Chicago 3 years later. Pat made a huge quantity of huachinango a la veracruzana, red snapper in a sauce laden with hot chiles and tomatoes. We did not learn until years later that Friedrich never ate tomatoes and seldom opted for hot dishes. 2 years after his year as a visiting professor in Mexico, Friedrich came to the University of Chicago as a candidate for a professorship in Latin American history. He gave a lucid and elegant lecture on the research he had just begun on the life and times of Pancho Villa, as his monumental book was titled when it appeared 30 years later. Early in 1971, after receiving Chicago's offer, Friedrich returned, this time with Jana, to visit the university and the city. I remember how relieved and delighted I was that Chicago's holiday decorations were still in place. Trees aglow with millions of tiny lights, street lamps decked out with huge plastic candy canes. Everything conspiring, we hoped, to lure them to Chicago. They did come, and they stayed. Over the next 20 years, Pat and I grew to love them both. Friedrich became my closest friend, mentor, and model. His superb scholarship was matched by a genuine warmth and kindness to colleagues and students that became legendary at Chicago and known everywhere. Students flocked to Chicago to study with him. Jana, of course, was his secret weapon. Where else in the world could you get both a PhD in history and first-class pediatric care for your kids for free? When they arrived in Chicago, Jana and Friedrich brought with them two amazing children. Both seem to have inherited Friedrich's talent for languages and his diplomatic skills. But what most amazed Pat and me on first meeting them was how, in contrast to the American kids we knew, they seemed perfectly at home talking to adults as though they might have something to say worth listening to. The lives that Leo and Jackie have made for themselves and their beautiful families in their adopted home was a constant source of joy and pride, both for Friedrich and for Jana. As proud as he was of his children, his own honors and distinctions, and there have been more than I could recount, seemed to leave him even more modest than before. Usually, I had to learn about them from others. The more exalted the honor, like the Águila Azteca from the government of Mexico, something like the Légion d'honneur of the French, the more exalted the honor, the more he worked to avoid mentioning. And when confronted by the incontrovertible evidence of yet another prize or award, he instantly changed the subject. Friedrich was not just respected, he was revered here and in Mexico, and indeed anywhere in the world that Mexico's epochal revolution was studied. It was enough to say that I knew him to rise in the estimation of anyone I knew. In Mexico, his death made the front pages of the national newspapers. At his funeral in Philadelphia, Claudio Lomnitz, who came to Chicago later than I, said that, among other things, Friedrich had taught him how to grow old. I met Friedrich at the beginning of my life as an historian, and as he did with so many of his students, Friedrich taught me how to grow up. He taught us all how to be better historians, but most of all, his example taught us how to be better human beings. I count myself among all those students of Friedrich for whom he served as an inspiration, as the inspiration of a lifetime. I have no words to express how much I admired and learned from Friedrich Katz, nor how much I will miss him.
I didn't meet Friedrich until I was past 40 years old, but in some ways I anticipated knowing him since graduate school at Columbia. Down the hall from my apartment on 163rd Street was a man who got up every morning, put on a suit and tie, began smoking a large cigar, got on the elevator, and walked out to buy the New York Times. When I got in the elevator and took in the cigar aroma, those were the good old days for cigar smokers, I knew he had been there. Like many others in Washington Heights, for example, Henry Kissinger's parents, this man was a Holocaust survivor. In the apartment below me, a woman played Viennese waltzes deep into the night. I never met her, but in a way, I thought I knew her story. The current New Yorker has an essay by a man who left Vienna in 1938. He also lives in Washington Heights, and among other things mentioned the large Dominican population living there. I had a favorite Dominican restaurant near my apartment where I could get a soup called ropa vieja, old clothes, for $2. It was spicy like a similar Korean soup. I was curious about both groups, the Holocaust survivors and the immigrants from the Dominican Republic, but I never got to know any of them well. Friedrich, of course, embodied both histories, the fate of European Jewry and the fascination of Latin America, especially Mexico. Perhaps I should have known more than I did about both subjects, but I didn't worry once I met Friedrich. I had my curiosity satisfied in countless conversations with him. Even though I was over 40 already, as I said, he was a kind of teacher to me. Somehow most of those conversations ended up in discussions of the left, the political left, and its 20th century experience. That was a subject I did know something about, and it cemented our friendship. Our friendship also perhaps owed to similarities in our work. We shared an interest in human beings in the depths of society, peasants, workers, ordinary people who somehow decide to stand up, organize, and make a difference, and thus become extraordinary. We both enjoyed working in archives and dusty old documents that reveal so much, although Friedrich had one thing on me: he knew how to dictate his books, and I never figured out how to do that. We shared an interest, or maybe a passion, for the details, which is why our books grew in length. But I think we assumed that someone who already knew a lot about the subject, or really wanted to know a lot, is going to find satisfaction, or the devil, in the details. Or as a quite similar scholar and friend of mine, when I was at the University of Washington, Jim Palais, once put it, if I work 2 decades on a book, people at least can have the decency to read 900 pages. My wife Meredith and I also socialized a lot with Jana and Friedrich. We were drawn to their European sensibility of how to live, what leisure time was good for, fine food and entertainment, and always wonderful conversation. But the real secret of our friendship is my wife's desire that I be or become, well, more like Friedrich, a gentleman and a scholar, slow to anger. In fact, I never saw him angry, always on an even keel. Be unassuming, my wife would say, like Friedrich. Just do your work, don't get involved in academic politics. Just be like Friedrich. I remember how purely loving and eloquent Friedrich was at Jackie's wedding, when he got up and in a few sentences expressed his devotion to her. As my friend, Friedrich was also my secret mentor about politics, about life. After all, I wouldn't want Meredith to get angry with me. And I have to say, she would like me to express her regrets at not being here today. She's in Jakarta. The author of the New Yorker essay ended by saying he wanted his ashes scattered over the Hudson River. He had become, in other words, a New Yorker. Through New York, Mexico City, Berlin, Chicago, Friedrich always remained Viennese. His remarkable and peripatetic life from his high school days onward, I was always amazed that he was in New York City in high school, coming from Europe, and already speaking several languages. From his high school days onward, made him a man of the world, and of course a man of many worlds. But in the end, he and Jana weren't going to let a swine like Hitler take Vienna away from them. So today, I want to salute a scholar, a gentleman, a courageous individual with a truly storied past, an exemplary husband and father, and a genuinely nice man who never let that get in the way of his considered scholarly judgment. Friedrich Katz. Thank you.
Friedrich believed that the past matters. He felt that getting what happened in the past right matters. Friedrich believed that the living have obligations to the dead, though I never heard him say so quite this way. And he certainly believed that the falsification of the past is done at the expense of the living. Understanding history, being true to history, is a condition of criticism and justice. And the obfuscation of the past, on the contrary, is the favorite instrument of ideologues and swindlers. In other words, Friedrich believed that truth is important for daily existence. Paradoxically, it is for this very reason that he subscribed to the notion that there is no such thing as, quote, a definitive history. For although Friedrich believed in the imperative of working to understand what transpired, he also knew that every generation has its own past, and therefore its own questions. In other words, each generation writes its own history. So, for instance, Friedrich never thought that his massive book on Pancho Villa, which it took him 20 years to write, was a definitive work. He knew that others, later generations, would come to be interested in the Mexican Revolution for reasons that were different from those that brought him to the subject, and that they, like he, had the right, even at times the obligation, to open their own lines of inquiry. It was also Friedrich's sense of responsibility toward those who passed, I think, that accounts for one of the signal traits of his character, irony. Friedrich was deeply ironic in his stance toward the everyday. He held the present at a distance that was created by his daily habit of sustained interrogation of the past, and by his tireless commitment to discovering truths that had gone unacknowledged or that had hence been forgotten or betrayed. Friedrich was used to peeling away the layers of self-justification that are routinely preferred by eloquent and powerful people in order to discover the rationale that conditions their decisions. As a matter of habit, he approached official language gingerly and was agnostic toward pronouncements of many kinds. I see the ironic Friedrich in my mind's eye, walking next to me, hands locked behind his back, deep in thought and conversation. I've never had a sustained conversation about the past, or about the past and the future in the present, like the one continual and sustained conversation that I had with Friedrich. Honestly, I don't believe that I ever will have a conversation like that again, except in my own encounter with the past, an engagement that is so deeply imprinted with Friedrich's dialectic that my mind sometimes shoots up his image involuntarily as a welcome counterpoint or as a guardian spirit counseling prudence one time, boldness another. I said before that Friedrich was deeply ironic. He was that, but he was never sarcastic. At least I never heard him be sarcastic. The care he had for the ancestors, for his parents, for instance, manifested itself in a commitment to truth, but not in the abuse of knowledge for denigrating people. The past to him was a source and site of criticism, but criticism as an uplifting exercise that instigates courage, prudence, beauty, and other virtues. Knowledge is not there to lord one's own lofty superiority over others. I shudder to think what a sarcastic or a bitter or an envious Friedrich might have been like. He would have been a monster. But he chose instead to be gentle. I want to close by invoking Friedrich's voice now that it's so sorely needed. The Mexican people have been a working people, a very hard-working people. A great part of the labor history of the contemporary America is the history of the Mexican people. But Mexico today is torn in a senseless drug war. Friedrich's work on the seemingly arcane past illuminates the current drama far more than the running commentary that we get from pundits and politicians. And the United States has legalized and protected the gun trade while criminalizing drugs and immigration. This is a lethal combination for Mexico. The long history of U.S. gun sales to Mexico, the complicated political equations between votes and business that led to short-sighted and sometimes criminal policies caused major upheaval and suffering and violence in Mexican history. This was indeed the subject of a significant portion of Friedrich's work. We need his voice and his wisdom now, right now. The past matters. We have obligations to our predecessors. Friedrich's example matters. Those of us who had such plentiful benefits from his work, his camaraderie, and his love are bound by it.
Friedrich Katz was an outstanding historian and the author of two classic books in his field of specialization, the Mexican Revolution. One was The Secret War in Mexico, the other, The Life and Times of Pancho Villa. Today, I do not intend to assess the historiographical value of those books, the awards they received, the opinions expressed by his colleagues, and the immense number of people who read them and will undoubtedly continue to do so in the future, make such an effort futile. Rather, I would like to talk about a facet of this great man only a few of us were lucky enough to know: his remarkable performance as a teacher. In effect, not only Katz was a magnificent historian, but also a very fine history professor. My memories of him date back to the late 70s and early 80s. Those years marked the publication of The Secret War and the beginning of his persecution of Villa. Yes, you can take that literally, for instead of consisting of a typical historical research, his was a type of pursuit. That is to say, he tracked Villa down most painstakingly, looking for information on him everywhere. And whereas General Pershing failed in his persecution of Villa, Katz succeeded in every possible way. Moreover, he did not portray Villa for us as a dead outlaw, as Pershing attempted, but rather as a living revolutionary with all his complexities and contradictions, and also with all of his possibilities and his contributions to Mexico's history. As a professor, Friedrich Katz was nothing less than extraordinary. While it is true that I attended his course, Latin American Civilization, a topic he explained to hundreds of undergraduates throughout 3 semesters, it was in his doctoral seminar on the Mexican Revolution where I really came to have the privilege of knowing him. I took that seminar as many times as I could, 6 in all. The first 4 times were during the years I was doing my doctorate, and the last 2 when I returned to Chicago to write my dissertation. My recollections of all those seminars are identical. Katz was a marvelous speaker. He didn't teach by reading notes. Rather, his classes were perfectly thought out in advance. So he explained, and I insist on that term, he explained the historical problem that he was analyzing. In intellectual terms, this is the most significant memory I have of his doctoral seminars. Thanks to his incredible historical perspective logic, and intelligence, he made any historical issue understandable for us, no matter how complex it was. Without overemphasizing theoretical aspects or referring to complicated concepts, he made history easy to grasp. A second feature of his seminars involved his extraordinary capability for bringing comparisons into the analysis. Thanks to his vast historical knowledge, Katz compared the particular aspect of the Mexican Revolution he was discussing with another issue or moment in Mexico or Latin American history, and especially with some other revolutionary process, preferably those that occurred in France, Russia, or Cuba. His seminars on the Mexican Revolution were, in fact, genuine classes on world history. Aside from his caliber as an intellectual, in his seminar, Katz revealed his great humaneness. I never heard him to be rude to a student, nor was he sarcastic. He was an affectionate, generous professor. His criticism of our papers were always respectful and constructive. He was interested in guiding us so we could improve them, the papers, and not in pointing out their shortcomings. Sure, he indicated where we were wrong, but above all, he stressed and sometimes even exaggerated those parts in which we were right. Another characteristic demonstrating his generous nature as a teacher was his tolerance of our difficulties with the English language. He never drew distinctions between those of us who were native speakers and those of us who were not. Undoubtedly, Katz, who ended up mastering several different languages, remembered his troubles as a child when a barbarous period of world history obliged his family to flee through several different countries and forced him to learn French, English, and Spanish before he even reached adolescence. His great magnanimity had its purpose. Katz didn't want to turn out frustrated students. He wanted us to be useful to our profession and to our discipline. He always nurtured and encouraged us. That is why all of his students love him. I don't know a single one who doesn't. In my name, and on behalf of my fellow students, Primitivo Rodriguez, Segundo Portilla, Ulises Beltrán, Ángeles Ruiz, as well as Chris Jones, Juan Mora, William Myers, Richard Estrada, Héctor Lindo, among many others, I have come to say, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, Professor Katz. We shall never be able to thank you for what you did for us. We are not only grateful for your concern regarding our daily life in Hyde Park. At heart, what we most appreciate is that you made us better historians, and with your example, better human beings. The memory of Friedrich Katz will live forever, as will our gratitude to him. As I mentioned before, we who were his students love him very deeply. As we say in Mexico, Professor Katz, siempre lo vamos a querer. We will always love you.
would like to begin by thanking the organizers of today's service for allowing me to say a few words about Friedrich Katz. It's an opportunity which I truly cherish. Over the last few months, and here today, I've heard many people praise Friedrich for his rather astounding research accomplishments, for his dedication to his graduate students, for his love of Mexico, for his congeniality as a colleague, and I certainly heartily second all of that praise. Yet I'd like to begin today by talking about yet another role Friedrich played, particularly in my life. You see, I was an undergraduate here at the University of Chicago, and when I was 19 years old, I, like many people around that age, was trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life. I had reached the point where I wanted to consider studying the history of someplace that was not the United States and was not Western Europe. And to begin exploring one possibility, I signed up, quite innocently, for a course called Latin American Civilization 1. The instructor, as you probably guessed, was Friedrich Katz. For 10 weeks, I listened to Friedrich Katz teach us about the rise and fall of ancient American civilizations. He drew in 100 or so undergraduates, most of whom had no real interest in the subject to begin with tales of Aztec cannibalism and Mochica erotic art. But most of all, he made us think about how people built societies and economies and how they developed understandings of their lives. At the time, I had no idea that Friedrich Katz was an internationally famed expert on ancient American civilizations, and I had even less idea that he had moved on to become an even more well-known expert on the seemingly unrelated subject of the Mexican Revolution. What I did know when I was 19 was that here was someone who saw and taught history in a way that was so far beyond anything I had experienced before that it was really a completely different subject. Needless to say, I found it fascinating, and I continued exploring the possibility of seriously studying the history of Latin America until, at the ripe old age of 20, I decided that that was what I wanted to do with my life. And it is not a decision that I've ever regretted. Now, when one is a lowly undergraduate, one rarely has the chance to really get to know a famous professor. But fortunately, I decided to return here to the university for my graduate studies. This not only allowed me to take courses with Friedrich on his other intellectual love, the Mexican Revolution, it allowed me to come to appreciate many things about Friedrich that went far beyond his amazing intellect and expertise. One such thing was his fascinating personal history, which he showed us in bits and pieces as he deployed telling anecdotes to make key points in classes, or, more rarely, entertained us on social occasions. Here was a man who'd managed to live and survive the history of the world in the 20th century in a way that few others had. Other qualities which I came to treasure were his kindness and gentleness. My wife and I still remember fondly how, during an obviously busy visit to San Diego, where he'd gone to give a talk at the University of California in San Diego, he took the time to take us, a couple of struggling graduate students, to the finest restaurant in La Jolla. He not only fed us the best food we'd had in many months, he made us feel important by taking an interest in our lives. Friedrich treated graduate students with a spiritual generosity and seemingly infinite patience. And whenever I needed chiding, which certainly I sometimes did, he delivered it with a good-humored smile, which I still remember. I'd like to end by expressing my condolences to Friedrich's family, but also by saying that although I will miss him, more than anything, I am thankful that I had the opportunity to know him. He was not only a great intellectual, he was a wonderful person. Thank you.
Jana, Jackie, Leo, my deepest condolences. I remember the day I first met Friedrich Katz. It was a sunny weekend morning in Mexico City in 1978 or 79. I was about 19 or 20, making my way from Villa Olímpica to my parents' home in Ciudad Satélite. At the Metro Insurgentes, a table with books called my attention. La servidumbre agraria en México en la época porfiriana. At the time, though I didn't know it, he was in his early 50s. He had already published his books on the Aztecs and ancient American civilizations and was probably in the process of rewriting his book on Germany and the Mexican Revolution into The Amazing Secret War. In that marvelous little book, I first discovered Friedrich Katz, a brilliantly insightful historian, a writer who could open windows and talk in novel and nuanced ways of fundamental aspects of Mexican history, my history. The second time was here at the University of Chicago, where I arrived as a graduate student, thanks to his and John Coatsworth's kind auspices. One October morning in 1985, at the Social Sciences building, Susan Lundy directed me to his door. Warm and welcoming, he invited me to sit at a chair for visitors he had near his desk, close to the door. Unaware of his history, I was surprised not only at his command of Spanish, but also at the thoughtful concern with which he asked whether my family, which he did not know, had been affected by the terrible earthquake in Mexico just a few weeks before. Keen to discover more about him, I looked intently, but his office was dark. He didn't have the lights on, and the only thing I could see was his dark silhouette outlined against the bright glare of the light streaming in from the window on the other side of his desk. It was in a classroom in Regenstein that I and other students could slowly begin to know him better. We quickly appreciated his immense knowledge of Mexico and popular movements, but he nevertheless remained a bit of a puzzle. He was a very different kind of professor. No matter how momentous the events he discussed, his was always a soft, measured voice, constantly weighing factors and possibilities, asking questions, touching on nuances, smiling when history offered irony, and often referring to events very remote in time or place to Mexican revolts and revolutions, like the Cossacks. But it was really after leaving Chicago early and becoming a sort of floating student that I began to learn more about him. He was an infinitely generous and optimistic and patient teacher, always welcoming me when I reappeared, lending me a hand as I tried to learn the rudiments of the art he mastered so well. In that very soft voice of his, once and again he asked questions that never sounded alarmingly big when he asked them, but which later, upon reflection, always turned out to be very complex, delving straight into the core of a problem and reframing issues and events in larger contexts and wider interpretations. Sometimes these conversations took place over the phone, but the ones I treasured most usually happened when we coincided at meetings and we walked over to a nearby cafe to eat a pastry while we talked, and he asked his quietly voiced questions. He loved his students. Whenever he was present and any of us was giving a talk, he would come, sitting in the front row and listening intently. Ever mindful of our progress, he was pleased when one of us did well and concerned when we encountered problems. For me, he was a pillar and a compass. I turned to him when confronted with circumstances that demanded it. I and a few colleagues spearheaded, scared and inexperienced, a faculty union in Mexico. His calm and insightful questions helped me find my bearings in what was a truly intimidating situation. But Friedrich cared for us, students, even more as persons. He was happy for what was good in our lives, and he sincerely felt for our misadventures. The untimely passing of some of his students distressed him, and I remember well the desolation in his eyes at the 2001 LASA, where instead of listening to David Walker, he paid him a profoundly sad tribute. There was in Friedrich Katz what I can only describe as an inner harmony, a poetry of ethics that was a backbone of who he was. This harmony, this sense of ethics, was not only the source of his love and interest in Mexican history. It also informed his insights into the actions of historical actors and was a mainstay of his practice of his twin crafts of teacher and historian, of the profoundly respectful way in which he worked with students and with sources, with the actors and the events he studied. He was open to new ideas and genuinely happy for the love he inspired. Perhaps the smile I will remember most was when, at the end of the celebrations for his 80th birthday, When Jana brought out the cake, everybody in the room broke out singing Las Mañanitas for him. His was the smile of a man sincere and happy in his affection for the people who loved him. Friedrich had a heart of gold. Famous, admired, and beloved as he was, he remained a real person. Beyond and above everything for almost 25 years, he was for me a guide, a friend, an example of what it means to be a scholar, a teacher, a friend, a family man, and a human being. This was his gift to us. It is our turn to honor him and pass it on.
Before I start what I wrote, I want to say, because I think he would have liked it, that while we are remembering him here in the formal and respectful fashion that we are expected to do, we also have, for the reception, done something I think he would have liked even better, which is to bring some mariachi to sing corridos from Villa, which he truly enjoyed, and I think with which he would have liked to be given his last farewell. So I hope you will join us there for that. Friedrich Katz was the most eminent historian of modern Mexico, writing in the second half of the 20th century. He didn't like me to say that, and often pleaded with me to refrain from doing so. But it was the truth. He was as unassuming as he was accomplished, a rare combination that was not only admirable but endearing. His Central European erudition and the lessons learned from the peripatetic nature of his early life prepared him to see the history of Mexico in a whole new light. The revolution reinterpreted as an episode in the international history of imperialist struggles. The comparative analysis of modern revolutions. The complex and contradictory social upheaval led by Pancho Villa, finally pulled out of the shadows, clarified. In these and other important areas of historical inquiry, he was a great master, and we all now follow in his steps, whether or not we know it. And let's not forget his extraordinary study of the social organization of the ancient American civilizations, the subject of his first doctoral dissertation, still many, many decades later, a model of analytical clarity in comparative history. He has been justly praised here and elsewhere for the scope of his research. For the Villa book alone, some 70 archives and documentary collections in 8 countries, certainly a lofty standard for a field like ours or for any other. But I think there is another often unacknowledged quality that made Friedrich a wonderful and popular historian. He was a gifted storyteller, a firm believer in an age of methodological specialization and technical terminology, in the explanatory and emotive powers of a deeply grounded and artfully structured general narrative. Few people know that he dictated the first draft of everything he ever published into a tape recorder instead of writing it down. His texts were conceived with an ear for the flow of the spoken word. This was a fundamental aspect of his craft. It harks back to an ancient tradition of combining research with the art of storytelling, which is at the very root of our profession. There was, I think, a lot of Thucydides in him, but also of Herodotus. For nearly a century now, Mexican studies have been a prominent component of the University of Chicago's research agenda in the social sciences. And during 40 of those years, Friedrich Katz was at the very center of that endeavor. He insisted on the necessity of making our intellectual conversations and debates fully international, long before that became fashionable in US universities. Under his guidance, Chicago became a second home to numerous Mexican scholars and thinkers. First with John Coatsworth, and later with Claudio Lomnitz, Friedrich welcomed visiting professors and lecturers, trained large numbers of graduate students, and organized several international conferences of lasting intellectual importance. He made Chicago into the leading center for Mexican historical studies in this country. And so, as you've heard, it was only fitting that upon his retirement, the university would establish a Center for Mexican Studies named after him to honor his vision and accomplishments and foster the continuation of his life's work. Katz's Mexico did not end, I should say, at the Rio Grande. It also included Chicago, where Mexican migrants have lived and worked for the last 100 years, and where, as you heard, Friedrich spent the second half of his long and eventful life. He became a beloved and revered public figure, not only south of the border, but also in Chicago's large Mexican community. With them, he habitually shared, readily and without pretension, his enormous knowledge of and enthusiasm for all things Mexican. His death was front-page news in Pilsen and Little Village, as well as in Mexico City and in Chihuahua. As others have mentioned, kindness was one of the qualities that defined him. Brilliant scholars can sometimes be impatient, abrupt, aloof, unapproachable. It's not hard to think of examples around here, but not Friedrich Katz. No matter who you were, he always had time to talk and to listen. A scholar of great authority, he was anything but authoritarian, because he believed that his word would never be the last one, even when it was. He relished fresh ideas, new research. The ambitions of the young mind were his until the end. 2 years ago, he'd long retired by then, a beginning graduate student wrote a seminar paper challenging some of the central arguments and conclusions in his famous book, The Secret War in Mexico, a book that transformed our understanding of the Mexican Revolution. I mentioned it to Friedrich, and he asked to read it. Afterwards, he called the fearful student and met with him to discuss the paper, offering praise, probing questions, sage advice, and much, much encouragement. The motto of this university, his university, is Crescat Scientia Vita Excolatur. Let knowledge grow from more to more, and so be human life enriched. Of Friedrich Katz, it can be said that he lived this ideal faithfully and with rare distinction. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming here today. Your words and your presence here today help keep my father's memory vivid. The University of Chicago held a very special place in my father's heart. It was here that he settled after moving to the United States. He taught here for 40 years, and it was here that he and my mom raised my brother and me, and where my father spent the happiest and most productive years of his life. He built many strong and sustaining friendships here with colleagues, with students, many of whom came here from Mexico. And like my father, my mom, and my brother and I became very close to so many of you. My father loved this university, and he convinced my brother and me to come here to college and to law school, and we came to love it too. And when we graduated here in Rockefeller Chapel, my father marched in the convocation in all the splendor of his full university regalia. The Regenstein Library is where my father taught me how to do research. And I have many wonderful memories of the lunches that we had together at the Quadrangle Club and of our walks around campus that somehow always led us back to the seminary co-op bookstore at the end. My father's thoughts rarely turned to death, but on one of the few occasions when they did, several years ago, he told me that if there was to be a memorial service for him, he would like to have me sing his favorite song, Red River Valley, which he often sang to me when I was little. And it is the best way that I can think of to say goodbye, not only to you, but to him. From this valley they say you are going. We will miss your bright eyes and sweet smile, for they say you have taken the sunshine that has brightened our path for a while. Come and sit by my side if you love me. Do not hasten to bid me adieu, but remember the Red River Valley and the cowboy that loves you so true.
Among the prizes and recognitions accorded my father, there's really only one that I heard him make much of. The only one he included in a fragmentary memoir that he wrote for his grandchildren shortly before his death. It was the Prix de Camaraderie, given him at the age of 8 by his fellow classmates at a Parisian elementary school. Unlike other prizes which you were awarded for scholarly achievement, he proudly tells his grandchildren, this prize was awarded by a vote of the class who was the best friend or comrade within the class. The child really is the father of the man here. Having heard the warm words that have just been said about my father, and for which I want to thank you, isn't it strange how that Prix de Camaraderie prefigured what came after? To be sure, such words are de rigueur on occasions such as this, but I have the feeling that they really came from the heart more than they often do. The abundant kindness that won my father, that Prix de Camaraderie, and which led a friend in later life to nickname him La Bondad con Patas, that kindness stayed with him to his dying day. Almost his last words, before he lapsed into coma, the last words he uttered as he was being carried on a stretcher from his hospital room to the hospice, he insistently tugged my mother's arm and asked whether she had made sure to adequately tip the porters who had just carried him to his deathbed. The greatest beneficiaries of that abundance of kindness, love, and devotion were, of course, we, his family. And we weren't always as appreciative as we should have been. I, in particular, must confess that only very recently I felt something bordering on resentment because of the awkward example it set for me. It happened on the day before Thanksgiving 2009, the last Thanksgiving he was to have. My parents were going to spend it with us in Philadelphia. Thanksgiving that year coincidentally happened to fall on my mother's birthday. As I came down for breakfast, my wife Claire rushed toward me, embraced me with tears in her eyes, and thanked me for the dozen roses she had just received from me and that unbelievably moving love letter I had written her. "Forgive me," I said, "but I actually didn't order you any roses or write you any letter." "Impossible," she said. "Who else would have sent it? This is not the letter that a secret admirer would write me." And then the truth, of course, dawned on us. The roses had been ordered by my father for my mother in anticipation of that birthday and directed to our address where they were going to be. And the letter was, of course, intended for her. My wife was crushed. This love letter, written by a man to his wife in their 54th year of marriage, my wife complained was more passionate than anything I had ever put on paper. Well, I think you can see how it is possible, sometimes at least, to resent my father's gift for love and kindness. Among the things that mattered to my father, family and friends were at the top. His work and his causes came next, followed by many others. What came last were the outward insignia of success. Unlike other academics, my father was not in the habit of keeping an up-to-date CV. He never made any effort to keep an adequate record of his publications or prizes and distinctions. This went so far that on occasion, the author's bio in the back of one of his books will list totally inaccurate approximations of the titles of books that he wrote. As a friend of mine said after attending his funeral, he was a great man, and part of what made him so great is that he did not need to be one. He was perfectly content to be that good comrade for which he was recognized as an 8-year-old boy. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Please do join us for a lunch reception across the street in Ida Noyes. Thank you.